So climate gentrification essentially is when we look at some popular areas of real estate. So if, for example, Miami Beach, South Beach, some of that property on the sea level aspect of things is actually becoming cheaper because people are looking into lower, higher risen acreage or land, which essentially was kind of known for being a lower socioeconomic landscape. So in the future, we talk about luxury and we workshop this internally so much with our team. For now, we think of the future of luxury as being a handbag and some nice shoes. Fast forward 10 years, and what we'll see is that luxury will take the place of intangibles. So if you want to call it the blue gold, access to clean, fresh water, or perhaps you want to call it living in a neighborhood where you have the freshest, purest air. These are kind of the new indicators on what luxury is and what it isn't. Google is developing some technology that actually allows you to hone in on an area on their maps to identify what kind of postcode has the cleanest air. And so these ideas, your postcode will now not be whether you live in Calabasas in the US, but whether you live in that neighborhood that is known for having access to that. Now, when we look at the societal shifts that are affecting the pressures of everyday people, there again are some really contrasting information emerging when we split the world in half. One is around demographic polarization. So essentially, we are seeing this huge youth tsunami take place in many regions of the world, and at the same time, there's a massive amount of elder people that really don't have the support or resources that they need. So if you look at China, for example, they ended their one-child policy a few years ago, but what's happened, there's tilted the kind of population pyramid where all of a sudden, you have these young kind of millennial children that are supporting two parents without any sibling support. So it's really reshaping what that pressure looks like for younger cohorts. Automation is obviously increasing, but for the sake of time, all of these are kind of deep dive white papers. So if you're interested in one area, we can kind of cherry pick that apart. But one other shift that's taking place is the power shift that's moving from the west to the east. And this is really driven by China. Again, I'm going to make this a succinct kind of elevator pitch on what's happening there. Essentially, when you look in the West, places like the US versus China, China and the Chinese Communist Party, essentially a dictatorship, is in a really prime position to take over the world. That's a dramatic sentence, but why I say that is when you look at the factors that are taking place in the West, and that's the fact that we have a government and political figures that don't actually believe in some of the most fundamental advancements that we need today, namely environmental kind of regulation and artificial intelligence. Investment in those two areas is coming from a bottom-up approach in the US. When we look at China, it's coming from a top-down approach. And because it is a dictatorship, those will be implemented en masse. And if you look in the West, what we see is it's kind of the grassroots bubble that's really pushing for this change and fighting against this huge old institution. So when we look at what's happening in China, we have to kind of be a little bit, bracing and see what happens with trade relations and things like that. But the fact alone that their investment in AI and technology like blockchain far supersedes anywhere in the world, whether it's looking at the amount of STEM graduates coming out of China versus other countries, or perhaps if you're looking at the amount of patents that they're submitting for different technologies. Even when our team in China analysed things like the amount of supercomputers they own, it far outstrips any other country. And when we enter the quantum era, we're going to need supercomputers to process all this data, and they're going to be in the prime position to do that. So that was kind of the scary part, but there are some kind of positive things coming out of 2021. So because this is about the future feelings, what we wanted to do was share with you 3 different consumer cohorts, and I feel like you're missing a word from that. So that should be the compressionalists, which is the first one we're starting on. Then we're going to go into the kindness keepers and then the market makers. We have a 4th one for 2021, but for the sake of time, we'll try and cut it short. Now, no matter where you sit on that generational spectrum, like I was saying, the feeling of being kind of overwhelmed with all the pressure that's taking place is predominantly a demographic cohesive trend, but are there any millennials in the room? Hands up if you're a millennial. Okay, well, you can actually feel, rest assured that your burnout that's taking place, or this pressure, I don't know why the fonts have gone all funny, but bear with me. It's valid. So we kind of get the bad end of the stick with people saying, millennials, we complain a lot and we just post our avocado toast on Instagram, that sort of thing. But again, put my sociological hat on, and what you find is that there are so many factors This looks a little better, but you're missing some things. There are some factors that are really driving this increased burnout that's taking place. So if you look at the correlation of increased productivity and increased labor, that's going up, but the increase in salary is actually not going up, nowhere near the rate of change as expected. So if we look at our predecessors, so Gen X, when they were aged 30 to 34, they saw an increase in salary of 30%. When millennials entered that age bracket, 30 to 34, they saw a decrease in salary by 4%. So already we're in a trickier economic landscape, not to mention the new expectations that is put on us as a workforce. So all of a sudden we live in kind of a world where, this work is all mentality, and always working and always on, or hashtag never not working, is glamorized by, prominent figures like Elon Musk, who boasts about working 80 hours a week. You've got Jack Ma from Alibaba that boasts about his 996 policy, and that's working 9 to 9, 6 days a week. And all this rhetoric that's coming through has kind of made us feel like our work is almost like a religion, a bit of a cult. And you see that from all these direct-to-consumer brands popping up and making it a bit cultural to work there and things like that. Now, what's leading to, kind of ricocheting off millennial burnout is time affluence and more awareness and studies, psychological studies around that. So time affluence is a real thing, and it's a person feeling that they do not have enough time in the day. And when you dig through the stats, it kind of edges out to be around 80% of adults share this sentiment. I'm sure it's a lot higher than this. But interestingly, time poverty exists again across all income levels and age groups. It's not a socioeconomic divide, and the effects are quite profound. Harvard did a really big study on this, and one of their professors found that those who feel time poor experience lower levels of happiness and higher levels of anxiety and stress. Not to mention that those that are time poor, they actually exercise less, they eat less healthy, they're less productive in the workplace, and they're more likely to get divorced. So that should be motivation enough if you're in a relationship to realize that you need to kind of get a bit more smart about measuring your time. Because we're living in that quantified era where we track absolutely everything from what we eat to our steps to our sleep, but how mindful are you about your time? Sorry about the formatting on this, but it's a bit gibberish. If anyone wants the proper slides after, come and see me. So how is this impacting some of the younger generations? Well, it's a new time because now we have this actual psychological effect called superhuman syndrome that's arising. Now, that's this idea that, we're chasing perfection, but perfectionism is this constant moving target that we can never quite get. So you end up feeling a lot of guilt afterwards. And there was a great 27-year meta-study done by 2 psychologists. If anyone's interested, I can share that with you as well. And what they found, they curated and aggregated all these data points around perfectionism and found that now it's not just kind of one definition, but for younger generations, it's broken down to 3 tiers. So you have self-oriented perfectionists, so think about that as kind of your competition peer. You have socially prescribed perfectionists, and that's your acceptance tier. And now we have other-oriented perfectionists, which is the validation tier. So all of a sudden, that idea of kind of posting on social media and having to kind of delete or archive a photo because it didn't get enough likes is starting to change because all of these kids have these different dimensions of perfection that they're shooting for, and it's having a very detrimental effect on their mental health, which is another huge conversation. So this millennial burnout is in fact leading us to a cohort that's time poor, decision diverse, and essentially when we talk about decision aversion, that is choice paralysis. So one solution we've kind of baked into the future for this forecast is that if you are building a consumer tribe around the compression list, you have to really engineer around this problem of choice paralysis. So I don't know if it sounds mumbo jumbo, but does anyone have choice paralysis? A couple of people. And some people are probably going, what does that even mean? So this is what the definition is. You finish work, you get home, you go onto Netflix or YouTube, and you spend more time watching trailers than you do deciding what to watch. So I don't know if that changes the statistic for anyone, but essentially, this is a big problem for people that need to sell things to people. Because we live in such a cluttered digital landscape where now we actually don't even want to fight the good fight. We do a lot of tracking of e-commerce patterns, and what you see is people just add to cart, add to cart, add to cart, and never check out. It's the same with the Netflix effect. So this choice paralysis is going to be combated by direct-to-consumer brands that realize that they minimize their SKU count to not only kind of test and learn and grow collaboratively with their audience, but in doing that, you kind of trim the fat. Now, that's not to say you have to kind of pivot your business model and be this small direct consumer brand, but essentially realizing that if you are a larger heritage or legacy brand, get rid of those zombie SKUs. What isn't selling, what is making that customer walk into the store with see too many items and want to walk straight back out. And you can do that on the e-commerce experience, but that takes very sophisticated AI and kind of a good eye for understanding how to curate products with personalization in mind. Not to kind of scare you with stats, but with choice paralysis, what's interesting is that Microsoft actually claimed that the average person makes 35,000 decisions a day. Now that can be conscious and kind of subconscious, unconscious, it's kind of hard to track, but to think about that at the end of the day, if you're someone that's putting out messages to the world, do you really want to add to that noise? And breaking through that is obviously increasingly difficult. I have to speed up because I've got 15 minutes left and 2 more tribes, but one kind of knock-on effect that millennial burnout is having is that you wake up on a Saturday morning and essentially you cancel your plans because you're exhausted. Or you're working, that's the other one. So cancellation culture, and I don't know if you want to call it ghosting or bailing or whatever it is having a knock-on effect for categories like the restaurant business that saw in 2015 $16 billion lost off the back of this. But it's also actually having an impact in the workplace on productivity as well. I kind of spoke to some of these, so I'm going to skip ahead. For kindness keepers, it comes down to this idea of division and divisiveness that's taking place. And I'm sure, like I said, with the dichotomy that's happening in the presentation, it's happening in our landscape. And the issue with this is increasingly we live in filter bubbles and echo chambers that we are too afraid or too stubborn to get out of. I'm guilty of it. There's different tests you can do to see if you break that. I'll get to a few examples in a moment. But the idea is that the kindness keepers are kind of emerging to realize that we need to close that gap. We need to bridge the divide from all the divisiveness that is plaguing our landscapes, whether it's in communities, whether it's environmental, people with opposing opinions. So this is where some of the younger cohorts kind of coexist with older ones as well, because even when you look at some of the protests that are taking place across the world, you'll see, while it's very Gen Z activated, it's from a participation point of view, it kind of spans different demographics. Now, a little bit of context to understand why we're here. I feel like I always have to do the scary, morbid stuff first to get out of the way. But hate culture, it's been around since the 40s. We know it's very common, but what's dangerous about it is the casualization that's taking place. So now you're so dissociated from actual true hate experience that you view them on a screen, and that desensitizes you when all of a sudden you're kind of flicking through and seeing, you know, the flood, a fire, a cat meme. It's very hard for your emotions to kind of stick together in something cohesive. But if we look at some of the stats globally, and I'm not going to go through all the really scary ones, but you can see murder rates increasing in countries like Brazil. In Canada, in fact, hate crimes increased 47%, targeted towards Muslims and Jews. And in the UK, we've got far-right terrorism and LGBTQ crimes doubling in the past year. So again, it's not critical mass, it's not the majority, but it is kind of something that needs to be addressed and kept an eye on. Now, there's one way to look at this, and I think this quote really sums it up. Climate change will continue to get worse no matter how polite we are to one another, and that should say at a climate conference. And that's so true because, you know, we have the conversations with the same people, and that echo chamber echoes back at us, and so we build resilience around our ideas and think that the other, if you will, is wrong or doesn't get it, is stupid, whatever it is. And more importantly, is we are finding it difficult to have those conversations. So I don't know if politically any of your families or friends kind of have a different view than you, but having those tricky and tough conversations is becoming increasingly difficult. So there are a few apps that are kind of helping to bridge this divide. One is called Read Across the Aisle, and this one measures your political leaning by plugging into kind of your desktop browser or Facebook and assessing whether you're leaning to Republican or Democratic or whatever your kind of political allegiances are. and that then recommends some alternatives for you to watch. There's also Burst that does something similar on Reddit and aggregates all the different comments and kind of puts them in one place. So you're not just getting one side of an argument, but rather a more holistic, well-rounded one. Vice, a few years ago, was quite ahead of it and did this Chrome extension that you could plug into Facebook. It's called Like What You Hate, and it links with your Facebook and it tells you what other things you should like that you don't, that are assessed to be not in your kind of stream of general preferences. So when I plugged mine in, it was like, you should like Melania Trump. I was like, okay, I guess I should. So again, I'm trying to be more conscious of subscribing to opinions and voices outside my own bubble. Now, I'm going to skip ahead for the sake of time. I've got this big 11 minutes going at me. But one interesting thing coming off the back of the Kindness Keepers are some new ways to look at how to engage with it. So things like usually new metrics or ROIs for measuring that. So one could be kindness. And there's this really great example that came out of the US around Mercedes-Benz. And one of the managers there realized that in their customer service centers in the US, a really scary statistic when you're selling cars, 70% of Mercedes-Benz employees had never driven a Mercedes-Benz. And once he kind of had that statistics, he realized he had to do something for morale, but then also to kind of increase and help with the conversion of those sales. So he created an initiative where he would actually let people or any employee allow them to borrow a branded vehicle for 48 hours at a time. So really simple kind of internal initiatives that can have profound effects internally and externally when communicated. Now, I'm going to power through market makers. This one's quite interesting because this is where the optimistic side comes through. And there are a few reasons for that. If we look back to the West, we're kind of dealing with a cohort that's quite emotionally fragile, even though there is a stream of optimism. But a little bit of context of what's happening there. We have essentially pivoted from a post-truth society to a post-trust society. Now, that's a lot of kind of PS, isn't there? But what happened in 2016, if you kind of look at things globally, we were living in a landscape where politicians, institutions, organizations, anyone in a position of power realized that you could start to appeal to emotions and not facts. Now, how you can call it this, the Trump effect, whoever it was, but all of a sudden people realized the power in emotions and them not having to actually be factual. So fast forward 4 years of living in a post-truth society, we've landed in a post-trust society. So we have a trust deficit. We don't trust anyone, which has sparked things like the intimacy recession, birth strikers, and one of the trends in here, which I'm going to touch on, the rise of peer-to-peer powered networks. Privacy is another kind of play that plugs into that. Now, what we see is in Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, they're experiencing this wave of optimism that they haven't seen before. And that's around some of the huge populations. Sorry, you guys are like getting half the text there, so I really hope you're listening. Then they're seeing this youth tsunami that I was mentioning in some of the populations to take Africa by 2050. 50% of their population will be under 25. So this is where a lot of the younger voices are going to be coming from. Now, like I said about that age disparity and how it's kind of reshaping the population pyramid, this is happening for a few reasons. I'm going to just pluck out a few examples quickly. Take the UK birth rates at an all-time low of 14 years and accrediting that to things like the intimacy recession, birth strikers. We've got a new success sequence that we researched last year. So we kind of tracked what success looks like and means for millennials, and that has completely changed. Traditional markers are still important, but they are being delayed significantly. And then we've got, examples like China. 17% of the population is actually aged over 60, and that's forecasted to rise 30% by 2050. So again, this disparity that's taking place. Now, like I said, the youth superpower will emerge from some of these regions. But what's really interesting about that is that I think when we look at the China power shift that I mentioned earlier before, there's a lot of destigmatizing that's taking place. So for a long time, that narrative of made in China was kind of looked down upon, and that's starting to change not just within China, but also externally. So that's kind of another threat if you are a business that is dealing with a competitive base in China to keep in mind of. So if we look at China's top 100 total brands last year, their sales increased 23% year on year. Now, one of their brands, Lenovo, actually reported 72% of its earnings outside of China. So like I said, it's not just a vocal Chinese consumer base that have this new, I don't want to call it the sense of nationalism, but there's a new sense of pride that's coming out of Chinese consumers that they haven't had before. So when we look at the market makers, the other thing to keep in mind of is this is your kind of activist cohort. And for a lot of those narratives that are spread throughout our side of the news, it's the Greta effect. We see kind of the white faces of it. What's interesting though is there are so many activists coming out of Southeast Asia that aren't really being, allowed that press or that platform to stand up. So I've just been in Southeast Asia for the last month and a half. We have got an investment case to understand that we need to get inside the eyes and heads and minds of the consumers there, the younger cohort. So we're going to be doing a 2-year deep dive project on what that looks like. Now, for the youth, they have this act now or pay later mentality. So, the Greta effect has been quite significant in that she is trying to get the world to change. And like I said, they're age-old institutions that to radically move is going to take a top-down approach, not so much a grassroots one. And she's fighting the good fight, but this has actually resulted in a new psychological term called eco-anxiety. And this didn't really exist, say, 5 or so years ago. But now you add in those anxiety issues that are coming from social media and constant connectivity for the youth, and you pair that with the fact that they feel like they got the bad end of the stick with being given a planet that might only have 50 or so years left. This feels very morbid. This is meant to be the optimistic part, so I'm going to try and lift it up towards the end. Now, what's interesting about market makers, though, is this is your very disruptive force. So they feel like if they don't see themselves through representation or product kind of assortment, that they will do or create what is missing in the market. So think of your kind of direct-to-consumer unicorns coming out of this cohort. So what we see in terms of Southeast Asia as well is there's some emerging groups coming up that no one's really talking about or selling to or understanding the significance of the cohort. So one of those is Gen M, so Muslim millennials essentially. So they're gaining traction in kind of the modern fashion sense as well, but their projected spend is actually 327 billion by year's end, which is quite significant. You've also got the PWD market, so people with disabilities, that control over $8 trillion in disposable income that really aren't being addressed or catered to. There's some new changes coming through. We're seeing fashion lines create more able-bodied products and services, but for the most part, it really is playing in that novelty sector. No one's really understanding that there needs to be a wider sort of inclusivity and representation across all categories. One other example is Starbucks. They, in 2018, launched the first signing store for people with deaf or hard of hearing. And so they trained all their staff or hired only staff that could kind of assist with this, and they opened it near a university in DC that was close to a hard of hearing college as well. So there's kind of like some micro things gaining traction, but we don't think it will be there for the next few years. And like I was saying off the back of the trust deficiency that we're experiencing, this is creating people to go more insular. So all of a sudden, you actually have people that don't want to publicly outpour their messages and feeling on Instagram, but they're turning to dark social to do that increasingly with their friends. So I spoke about this the other day internally at a presentation we hosted at WeWork, and essentially I said that the future is encrypted. And you know that that's taking place because if you look at the growth of platforms like WhatsApp, they're actually outpacing ones like WeChat and Twitter. And increasingly, the tech giants who take Facebook have announced at Web Summit last year in Lisbon that they are testing a secret conversations tool within Messenger because they understand that the future is encrypted and that their audience actually wants an end-to-end private conversation. It's a big beast for them to get around because they actually have some partnerships with the police and target suicidal or bullying or terrorism through that. So they have to kind of work out some bigger issues before they go fully end-to-end encrypted. But that's where the future's going, smaller platforms. So direct-to-consumer brands are actually realizing this ahead of larger brands and going, we need to be peer-to-peer or facilitate peer-to-peer selling or connection. So I'm going to just go through a few quick examples because I've only got a minute and a half left. One is Store, STORR. It's a really interesting platform where in 3 clicks, you can be a store owner. Anyone can have a store in 3 clicks. So their premise is they curate from around 175 different brands like Adidas, Dan and Joe, a few big kind of players. And essentially, I could open up a store. I could give you my STOR account, and you buy from me because each brand gives me between 5 and 30% commission. So some brands specify it publicly. For example, Adidas would give me 6% of sales for whatever you brought through my store. But the great thing about Store is it actually has a social impact factor. So I can say, it's like I've got an Instagram interface that not only was this my revenue, but then I donated such and such percent to whatever charity. So they're really targeting that Gen Z consumer that wants to be able to draw new revenue and brag about their curated lifestyle, but they also want to do good with that at the same time. So this is cutting out the middleman, and the rise of peer-to-peer networks will truly challenge social shopping in the future.